Praise the Lord. I'm Bishop David G. Evans, and welcome once again to Jesus and Our Mental Health. I've counseled people for about 34 years, and one of the hidden concerns, one of the unspoken fears that I've had to counsel is that sometimes people fear that some emotional, psychiatric, psychological imbalances can be inherited. Now, we absolutely know that is true, that sometimes in our families, we have to often, we're going to be real about someone at present in our families. We've got to be real and start asking historic questions of our mothers and our grandmothers and our grandfathers. Was there ever anybody else like this in our family? Now, the problem with a lot of that is that back in the old days, back in the day, when I'm speaking back in the day, I'm talking about the 50s, 60s, 40s, families often didn't talk about any kind of mental health issues that were going on. They would just mislabel them. He's different. She's a little strange. She don't say much. We would hang signs of comfort on something that we knew beneath and in our heart was uncomfortable. We would label people irresponsible who were unreliable because we did not want to identify them as schizophrenic. We would say, oh, they're just up and down because we didn't want to identify them as bipolar. We would say that boy just has a hair trigger when they have some anger issues. We would strive to hang a sign of legitimacy on the life of someone that we loved. But then as you get older, you start having your children, and you start looking around you at the nieces and nephews and your siblings, and you start to wonder and start to believe that these signs of legitimacy are no longer adequate because understanding and knowledge has helped you understand that, watch what I'm about to say, there actually could be something wrong with someone that you love. Wow. That you will come to the conclusion that some trauma triggered, parent triggered something, some circumstance in life, some tragedy triggered something that was lying beneath. Like, for instance, as I've counseled schizophrenic people and bipolar people, I found that normally they are relatively okay until they start getting in there. It used to be 40s and 50s, but now it's in the 20s and 30s that something occurs that triggers an episode, and that's the beginning of it being what I would call manageable and explainable to something that is outward, unmanageable, and now no longer explainable. So you no longer can put some kind of legitimizing sign on their condition. This happens in families, this happens in our lives, that we have to come to a realization that, okay, something's wrong with my brother, something's wrong with my sister. My mom had an issue, my dad had an issue, my grandfather had an issue. Like on my dad's side of the family, they were prone to alcoholism. Now watch what happens. They were prone to alcoholism. I mean, it was the dominant problem on my dad's side. I remember being challenged by that. But watch this. I come from a family of brilliant people, but I also come from a family that during the time of civil rights injustices and all that persecution, these are brilliant people who had ceilings on them. And the way those brilliant people dealt with the fact that they would never reach the heights of their intelligence was alcohol. So they were brilliant, they were articulate, but they were hooked on substance. So I get to college, and that tendency is tempted by college life. So I tried a couple of things, tried some grain alcohol, and tried some Boone's Farm apple wine. Most of you don't know anything about that. Tried a little Tiger Rose, tried a little Thunderbird. All cheap stuff. You get $1.85 for a quart. That kind of, it was rot gut, we used to call it. And I realized that when I was under the influence, I thought some bizarre things, mostly violent, because my dad was a guy that killed somebody. And those tendencies would rise up, those thoughts would rise. And I came to the conclusion, I can't do that because something that's in me is going to come out. And I got saved later on in life and realized salvation put me in a position where I had the additional strength coming from God not to be tempted by a generational problem, which would manifest itself in crime, in mistreatment, and watch this, and a lot of other psychological things that were being, if you will, anesthetized by the alcohol in the family. So you can't, my point is, I had to make a decision at 26. No, had to make a decision at 19 because I went to college early, that I was not going to allow this generational thing to get a hold of me. Now, in some cases, like people I've counseled, there's a need for psychological or biblical counseling to help a person first recognize, secondarily understand, thirdly learn how to manage a condition. First is recognize, can't be in denial. Second, understand how that condition operates. And thirdly, get in a position of strength where you can manage the thing that you're going through. And sometimes, in certain cases, that will include, even though you're a believer, that will include some additional help through medicine. Sometimes that will be the case. Now, some of you will say, well, that's not faith. Well, if that's the case, why did Jesus, the great physician, carry a physician with him? Why did he keep a doctor in his crew? So, did he have a lack of faith? Or were there some things that didn't need a miracle that Luke could take care of? Okay, some of you are going to write me on this, but it's there in the Bible. If Jesus had a doctor with him, now could he cure everything? Of course he could. But some things he didn't need to address because he had a physician with him. He was the great physician. The stuff incurable stuff. The stuff that seemed impossible. But then he had Luke with him. So there's room for doctors in our lives as believers. So sometimes you'll need that. But the idea that I'm trying to get across to you today is that rather than see you, here's what's really crazy about this, and I'm not using the word in a negative sense. People know something's going on with them. And they look for people that will affirm the confusion that's going on inside of them. What's the recognition? So Jesus gets to the graveyard. Here's an illustration in the Bible. He goes to the graveyard. This guy's walking around. He's unusual. People have tried to restrain him. They've tied him down. They put a straitjacket on him in chains. Boom, boom. He breaks them up. He beats up the people. Jesus comes. And the first thing happens is that the man, the closer he gets to Jesus, he recognizes who the Lord is, his majesty, his power. And Jesus and him start having this conversation. And he asked the question, well, what's your name? He says, well, there's about 1,000 of us in here. In other words, he says there's a legion of us in here, meaning he has multiple voices going on in his head, multiple voices that influence him. So he's admitting, I've got a lot of confusion going on in here. So the first thing the man in the graveyard does is admit there's a lot of voices happening up in here. And then Jesus begins to have the conversation with him. And the whole point of the conversation is to first quiet the voices and then remove the influence. This is what the Lord can do. Now, sometimes, you may need some assistance with some pharmaceuticals that help steady you. No shame in that. The shame is knowing you need the help and refusing to get it. Now, we believe, of course, in divine healing. But I also know that there are times when the Lord heals through the work of a physician, and there can't be a negativity concerning physicians because Jesus had one in his crew. So what do I do when I begin to wonder, is Aunt BB, is her condition, did I inherit that? That's immediately when you need to have a conversation with a professional. Get that counseling. Watch this. Have the conversation. Sit down. I'm concerned about X, Y, and Z. And like myself, being a counselor, you'll ask the question, what behaviors, and it's a hard question, but a necessary one, what behaviors have you seen that gives you the impression that these influences may be expressing themselves in your life? Do you behave like the one you're afraid you inherited some characteristics from? What do you do about that? First off, that's the first recognition. Well, I tend to do this. I'm a little impulsive when it comes to that. I'm very resistant to change. It has to be my way or there's no way. I mean, those things that we legitimize by the way we talk about them, but it may indicate that the strongest voice in your life is the one going on in your head. So all of a sudden now, we have to get to an admission. Am I behaving in a way that causes me to feel as though some generational problem is coming? Now there's two solutions. There's a spiritual solution because the Bible lets us know that a generational hindrance, what the Bible calls a curse, can be broken in Jesus Christ. But we also understand that there can be a natural continuity. I think it's in John chapter 3 when it says the spirit of the flesh inherits the flesh, spirit the spirit. So the flesh inherits flesh, spirit inherits spirit. So there's a continuity between natural to natural and spiritual to spiritual. A lot of times what will happen is that we will attempt to minister to someone spiritually and forget the natural side of the counsel. So it has to happen on two fronts. I know a lot of people that are absolutely loving the Lord, but absolutely struggle with many emotional things. And a lot of it has to do with who they were related to. Some generational continuity of a condition that's being expressed in ways. And what happens is sometimes we become functional, so we minimize the impact. But in our private times, we are afraid that perhaps we have inherited something from another relative. So what are the things we have to do? Just to narrow this down. Number one, got to sit down and talk to somebody qualified. If your pastor is not qualified to do that, they don't have the biblical experience or the biblical breadth to give you biblical principles and deal with the spiritual and the psychological at the same time, because that's what the Bible does, then you will need, watch this, spiritual counseling and a professional to help you navigate. Because what you don't want to do is get to a point where this inherited thing starts to disrupt your life. The Bible lets us know clearly that Jesus has broken every spiritual curse. But the influence of those things have to be one. We have to overcome them at times. That influence can be a problem. So you're liberated, but you're still being leveraged, if you will, or influenced by something from your history. Some people would say, well, no, that's not deliberate. Deliverance is not often all at once. Deliverance is a process, a building of strength, a building of faith, a building of understanding so that you can manage what's going on within you. For instance, there was a time when I had a hair trigger temper. And I realized it was really bad for me. But then I looked back over some of the generations and some of the people that I was related to had the same hair trigger temper and had gotten them in trouble. And I didn't like the outcome. So I began to get closer and closer to the Lord. I began to have confidence in his word. And I began to understand he did not create me that way. I stopped making excuses for my anger and realized it was coming from another source. Not only had I inherited a tendency, but there was something in my life that made me angry. And for me, it happened to be in my childhood. So dishonesty about source will hinder your ability to be delivered from what you may fear is either generational or situational in your life. Now, this is the last thing I'm going to tell you. A friend of mine, her husband went to get their truck serviced. And he was always a little different. Nice guy, great provider, great career, had plenty of money. They lived very well. And he went to get the truck serviced. Something that simple. This is the point. What was supposed to take an hour and a half, 2 hours, I believe he was there 8 or 9 hours that day. He left home, the person everyone knew, 7 o'clock that morning. When he returned home, he was in a full-blown bipolar episode. Full-blown. The trigger was something on another day that he could have handled very well. But on that day, that waiting for that truck triggered him into a bipolar episode. And from that point on, he was treated for bipolar. What happens is schizophrenics, bipolar people, a host of conditions, personality disorders, some trauma becomes the trigger. So and we're back to another discussion, if family has put a legitimate sign on the condition and behavior, if family has explained it away, but you've come to the realization something's not quite right with me, the Bible, Jesus Christ is a wonderful counselor. You can stop the progression. You can absolutely stop the progression, but you've got to admit, come to face with it, come to realization, okay, I need help in this. Lord, will you help me? Absolutely would. At the same time, if you are in need of help identifying not just source, but development in your life, but that development has caused you to come to the place where you're asking yourself, did I inherit grandmom's stuff? Did I inherit grandpa's stuff? Did I inherit mom's stuff or dad's stuff? I see something in my brothers and sisters. Is that same thing lurking in me? Okay. If you've come to that realization, it's time to seek the Lord and to seek help. And of course, being a pastor, I think biblical counseling by someone who can do it and who's seen thousands of people delivered, I absolutely believe that you need both and you can get both to a qualified man or woman of God. Well, I'm out of time, but I'm not out of word. I want to thank you. I hope I helped you once again as we've had a conversation once again around Jesus and your mental health. I'll see you next time.